Hi there, I'm Pam, and we're in my kitchen again, where I share with you some of my favorite recipes or those most requested by my friends and family. Today we're going to be making no-knead Dutch oven bread, and I'm going to be using Jim Lahey's recipe and following his techniques. Now, if you're a seasoned baker or you've never made a loaf of bread in your life, I promise you that you can do this. You will be able to make a beautiful loaf of bread that looks, tastes, and smells like anything that you would buy out of an upscale bakery if you follow the recipe closely and watch the video. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is one piece of necessary equipment, and that is a Dutch oven. This is a Dutch oven. It's a big pot that's heavy with a heavy lid, and it can go inside your oven. Now, I've had this one for about 42 years. It was a wedding gift, and I use it primarily for soups and stews and spaghetti sauces. I prefer to use a cast iron Dutch oven, and that's what I've got in my oven right now, heating up. It's a Lodge 5-quart cast iron, and it just works really well for this recipe. I bought it at Target. I paid about $40 for it. You can get it at Walmart or Ace Hardware. Now, if you've already got a Dutch oven, no need to go out and purchase one. It's just that if you don't have one and you want to buy one economically, that's what I would recommend, because not only is it inexpensive, but it works really, really well. These type of Dutch ovens can cost a lot of money, and there's just no reason to invest in that. But if this is the kind of Dutch oven that you do have, and you don't have a metal handle on top, and your handle is plastic, you are definitely going to have to remove the handle. There will be a screw on the underside or the top, and take the handle off the plastic and drop the screw back in the hole. Or you could plug the hole with a piece of aluminum foil. You just don't want that hole venting moisture, because our bread is going to cook inside of this oven, within our oven, and it's going to steam, and we want to keep all that steam inside the pot. So again, just remove the plastic knob if that's what you've got on your Dutch oven. Some companies will say that the knobs are oven proof, but I've heard plenty of people say they didn't fare well. So the Dutch oven is the absolute necessary piece of equipment for this recipe. Okay, I would like to talk about why this is called no-knead bread. Why is there not a necessity to knead the bread? When we make a standard loaf of bread, you absolutely have to knead it. Whether you do it by hand or you do it in your mixer or your bread machine does it, you have to knead the bread to develop the gluten. So why don't we have to do that with this recipe? There's two reasons. This is a really wet dough. It's called high hydration dough. And along with the wet dough and the long fermentation period, which is overnight, the gluten molecules in your bread flour are able to align themselves in this wet dough over a long period of time, and it is absolutely unnecessary for us to knead the dough. As a matter of fact, you can't knead this dough. It is so sticky, it's impossible. But that is because it is a high hydration dough, and it's supposed to be that way. So there's no kneading of this. It's a 5-minute, let's mix up the dough, then you let it sit for several hours, and then you go back and you spend another 5 minutes shaping it, and that is all the hands-on time with this recipe. And anybody can do it, and I'd like to show you how. Now, there are a few pieces of equipment that will make this easier for you. You need a bowl, you need some measuring spoons, you need a wooden spoon. I like to have a whisk to blend my dry ingredients, but my favorite piece of equipment, besides the absolutely necessary Dutch oven, is my kitchen scale. Now, you don't have to have one of these, but it makes the job easy. Kitchen scales are fast and they're accurate. It takes a lot less time to measure flour on a scale than it does to scoop out of the bag, and it's a lot less messy as well. So how this works is you simply turn your scale on and you have a choice of pounds or grams, and I am choosing grams. This flour, this recipe calls for 400 grams of flour, so I'm going to put my bowl right on this scale. Now it's weighing my bowl. So I'm going to hit the 0 button, and it's taken the weight of my bowl off of the scale. And I'm going to take my flour, which is bread flour. You can use any brand you want, but I would highly recommend bread flour. It's a higher protein, and the gluten development is just better if you use bread flour when you're making bread. So all I'm going to do is pour until I reach 400 grams. There we go. I am at 404, so I'm just going to take out, yep, that'll do it, just a little bit. Now, I can take it off the scale, and I don't need this scale anymore. For the smaller ingredients, the salt and the yeast and whatever, I'm just going to measure it with measuring spoons. Now, if you don't have a kitchen scale and you don't want to buy one, they range $10 to $20. That's fine. You can measure 3 cups of flour. But I will tell you that I've experimented a lot with this scale and measuring out flour, and it never measures 400 grams when I do it by hand. So when you're measuring your flour and you don't have a scale, kind of fluff the flour up a little bit with a spoon and then scoop in and level off. Or take your spoon into the container of flour and spoon it into your measuring cup and then level it off. It will be close, but it won't be exact. Okay, so we have our flour in the bowl. You saw how easy that was, just measuring with the scale. I love using a scale. And this is a simple recipe of 4 ingredients: bread, flour, salt, yeast, and water. Now, salt, I like to use sea salt. You could use table salt. You could even use kosher salt, but I will tell you that kosher salt is flaky salt. It weighs less, and you're going to need to use more. So if I were you, I'd just start with table salt or sea salt. And we're going to take a teaspoon and a quarter. Now, you may decide after making a loaf that you like it a little saltier, but start with this. I think it's perfect. I never add more than this, but you might like to. We're also going to use yeast, and it's only a quarter teaspoon. You don't need a lot of yeast for this recipe. The yeast has a long time to do its work, and we don't want our bread to taste overly yeasty. We don't really want the taste of yeast in our bread at all. We just want it to do the job of rising the dough. So you may have noticed I dropped my yeast on one side and my salt on the other. Some people feel that if you put your salt in contact with your yeast, that it will affect the way the yeast works in the recipe. So I don't know if that's been proven, but some people strongly advise not to dump it on each other. So I put the yeast on one side and I put the salt on the other, and then I just mix it all together. That's it. Now, I have carefully measured 1 1/3 cup of water. This is not warm water, which most bread recipes will tell you about 100 degrees. You do not need to do that. Tap water is fine. And I also wanted to mention, you can use instant yeast or dry active yeast. I mean, either is fine. Any kind of yeast is fine. And you may have noticed, well, she didn't proof her yeast, which is or used to be a really smart thing to do when you were making bread. But modern yeast, if the date on the jar or the package is good and you don't add water that's too warm, which would kill the yeast, you're going to have no problem at all. So we don't need to proof the yeast. I've never, ever proofed the yeast with this recipe, and I've always had a lovely loaf of bread. So don't worry about it. Just buy fresh yeast. Keep it in your refrigerator and it will be fine. So we've got our flour, our yeast, and our salt in our bowl. And I am going to pour in on top of this my 1 1/3 cup of water. And I'm just going to stir it for about 30 seconds. Get a good grip on your wooden spoon because this is going to get stiff. Now, I will say that if you don't use a scale and you've measured and you got a little heavy-handed with the flour, and it's like, this is so dry and you can't incorporate all the dry flour in, add another tablespoon of water or 2 if necessary. But I'm still seeing a little bit of dry here, but I'm just mixing it for about 30 seconds. This is all the mixing we're going to do. And it's picking up the dry flour. And this is perfect. I know because I've weighed my flour, so I don't want to add any more water to this. Now, what you're going to get is a really sticky glob of dough. And that's exactly what you want. There, that's about 30 seconds worth. I'm going to take my rubber spatula and just clean off my spoon. And then I like to scrape the bowl down. There. My dough that's my bread dough right there. It is just a sticky glob. And as you can see, I touch it and it sticks all over my fingers. So I know it's perfect. So what we're going to do, I'm going to take a piece of plastic wrap, a big enough piece you can really stretch it around and seal it up tight, and put it aside for anywhere from 12 to 18 to 24 hours. Now, the recipe says 12 to 18 hours. I can tell you right now that 12 hours is not convenient. If I got up at 5 in the morning and mixed this dough, 12 hours later would be 5 in the evening. Now I take 5 minutes to shape my dough and I let it rest and rise for about 1.5 hours. Now it's 6:30. Okay, now I've got to bake the dough, which is another 45 minutes. Okay, so now it's almost 7:30. And then you have to let the bread cool. And I'll explain later why you're not going to cut into a hot loaf of bread. It's just too late in the evening to be convenient, 12 hours. So I never go the 12 hours for that reason. And the longer this ferments, the tastier the bread is. So I like to really give my bread a lot of time. So I usually let it go the full 18 hours. But don't stress too much about, okay, what time was it when I mixed it? And what time do I need to bake it? And don't worry about that. Just mix it up the day before you want to use it. And then the next day, calculate a little bit in your head how many hours it's been. But I've let it go as much as 24 hours. And it doesn't change anything. Now, I wouldn't leave it on your counter for 2 days. Oh, absolutely not. Mix it one day, bake it the next. But it's just within that time frame. Okay, so like I said, this needs to be covered and set aside for several hours till tomorrow. And when tomorrow comes, we pull out our board and we get ready to handle our dough again. This took 5 minutes. Did it even take 5 minutes? I don't know. Hands-on is so small with this recipe. Alrighty, so we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so we mixed up our dough and yesterday, right? And it has set for 17, 18 hours, maybe 24. And this is what we have now. What has happened to that stiff, sticky blob of dough is it slowly spreads out, it rises up, and then it settles a little bit. The color might get a wee bit darker, and it's going to be full of holes, which I don't know if you can see, but I will put a close-up. Full of holes. Those holes are created by the carbon dioxide gas that's coming from the yeast and is trapped within our gluten structure of the bread. And that's what gives our bread this beautiful crumb on the inside. So I'm going to uncover this. And, you can see, if you use a glass bowl, you can see, it's just, your bread has fermented if it's full of holes. Okay. And another way you can tell, if you tip your bowl, you can see the gluten strands in the dough up at the top stretching. So this dough is fully fermented and ready to be shaped. Now I want to you know what I want to mention? This is a grody old little oven thermometer. I have two of them. One's in my oven, and this is one I always have an extra, and I've used them both over the years. I would really recommend that you use one of these. My oven, to be truthful, is not very accurate. I really need to replace the thing. So I always keep one in there. But you want your oven heated to 475. And just to be sure it is at 475, invest in one of these. While you're at Ace Hardware buying your Lodge cast iron Dutch oven, pick up one of these as well. Okay, so what we're going to do here, we took 5 minutes yesterday, remember, to shape this, mix it up. Now we're going to take maybe another 2 or 3 minutes to make our loaf. So I've got some flour. Doesn't matter what kind here, it could be all-purpose or bread flour. And I'm going to pretty heavily flour my board. Now this is just a little plastic scraper. You can use a spatula. I like this because I can get into the bowl easily without a handle. So what we're going to do is carefully scrape out our dough onto our floured surface. Try not to deflate your dough. This is the rising part of our dough, and we just don't want to punch it down. You never want to punch down no-knead Dutch oven bread. Okay, we just want to carefully dump it out of the bowl. And you can see all those holes and that stretchy gluten that's developed all by itself without us ever kneading. And you can see why we couldn't knead this. It's just really sticky. All right, so what I have here is a really wobbly, can you see that? Glob of dough. So, and it's super sticky. So I've got flour handy. Don't dump flour on the loaf. We've floured the board. Now we're going to flour our hands, and we're simply going to get under and flip it over and go to the other side and flip it over. Do that on both sides. Okay, now we're going to flip the whole thing over, and we're going to just sprinkle some flour on top because it's still kind of sticky. Just you don't want to add flour to the dough. This is just simply so we can handle it. Okay, now we're going to just kind of shape it into a loaf. Nice circle. Okay. Now this is something that I like to do. I read it somewhere, and I find it works really well. I take this round loaf and I just pull it towards me on the board. Just what it does is it creates some tension across the top of the loaf, and I find that the loaf holds its shape better when it's rising. Because this is such a wet dough, you may experience your dough going out this way. That's why I emphasize 1 1/3 cup of water and not the 1 1/2 cup that you see on a lot of recipes on the internet. I have never had luck with 1 1/2 cups of water. The dough is too slack. So this just creates some tension across the top of the loaf and helps to keep its shape. Now, I have a piece of parchment paper here. This is a bench scraper. It comes by a lot of names. A dough cutter, anyway, bench scraper. If you don't have one of these, don't worry about it. Just scoop this up and set it on your paper. But I like to use it for this. So I put it on my parchment paper, and I put it right back on the board I was working on. And then I quite heavily cover it with some more flour. This is going to keep it from sticking to the towel. So I put a towel over the top of it, kind of tuck it around so the air doesn't get in. And I'm going to let this set for 1 to 2 hours. Typically it takes about an hour and a half in my house, but it depends on how hot your house is. If you keep your house at 75 degrees, it'll probably be ready in an hour. If your house is cold, it might take 2. It's not going to double, okay? What you're gonna wanna do in an hour, come along, poke it, and if the indentation stays, it's ready. If it doesn't, give it another 15 minutes to a half an hour. But anyway, we're just going to cover this and let it sit for an hour or 2. And we're going to turn on our oven 30 minutes before this is ready. So it's a little guesswork, but even if your Dutch oven sits in your oven for an hour heating, it won't hurt anything. But the Dutch oven needs to be in the oven with the lid on for at least 30 minutes at 475 degrees. Because when we move this into the Dutch oven, which will go into our oven, it has to be piping hot. So this is going to sit, and we will come back to it when it's ready to go in the oven. Okay, this is our loaf of bread. It's actually a different loaf, but to speed up this process and not take 2 days to make the video. So if you say, that's not the towel she laid down a few minutes ago, you're right. But this is the loaf of bread that was shaped and has risen for about an hour and a half. My Dutch oven just came out of my oven. It is super hot, but I just wanted to show you what I do before I put it in. Now, you're going to take a knife. And if you want to, you don't have to do this, but I like to, and just make some slashes. I think it helps to give your bread a little more of a lift in the oven when it's cooking. You could dust it heavily with flour if you like that contrast between the inside of the loaf and the crust. But anyway, what we're going to do now is simply take this bread, and we're going to lift it, paper and all, and set it in our Dutch oven. And I'm going to take this over to the stove and put it in my oven right now. I'm back. I'm going to set my timer for 30 minutes at 475 degrees, 30 minutes. The Dutch oven is sealed and covered. When the timer goes off, I'm going to open the oven. I'm going to pull out the shelf, remove the lid, put it back in the oven, and let it continue cooking for 15 minutes. And then when the timer goes off in 15 minutes, our bread will be done. Now, what's happening in the oven right now? That blast of heat that loaf, that raw dough received when I put it in the Dutch oven and then put it in my big oven is causing the yeast to go crazy. And it's going to give our bread an initial rise. You saw it was kind of flat. It's going to puff up and it's going to give it a nice rise. And when the bread gets to 140 degrees, the yeast is going to die because it's done its work, and the bread is going to continue to cook and steam in that Dutch oven. The crust will be really hard and crispy, and it will soften up when it comes out of the oven just a little bit, but the bread's in there cooking, and we are going to just leave it alone for 30 minutes, come back, open the oven, take off the lid, set it for another 15 minutes, and then our bread will be done. See you in a bit. Okay, this has baked for 30 minutes at 475. I'm taking the lid off and I'm putting it back in the oven for 15 minutes. Okay, I have taken my bread out of the oven. I baked it for 30 minutes at 475. I took the lid off after 30 minutes. I baked it another 15 minutes without the lid. And now I'm just going to lift it out of here. Sometimes the paper will tear because it's gotten dark and it's just a little more fragile. But usually it can be managed to just lift it out with the paper because it's very hot. Just slide it off the paper and leave it there to cool. As I mentioned earlier, bread right out of the oven is continuing to bake. It's the last stage of the baking process, and you may hear some snapping and crackling and just little noises coming out of the bread. They call that singing in the baker's world. And what's happening is steam is escaping from the little holes in the crust. But the inside's going to continue to bake, and the crust on the outside will soften up just a little. If you take it right out of the oven, it's like a rock, but it will soften a little bit and you will get that chewy, crispy crust with that beautiful center with a really nice crumb. So I'm going to move this very hot pot back over to my stove. And I wanted to tell you, so you noticed I slashed the bread 3 ways this way, and on this one I did a cross. You can do whatever design you want, intricate or not. But I did read an interesting story that back in the olden days, the villagers would put their bread in a communal oven. And in order to identify whose bread was whose when it came out, they had all put their own individual markings on their bread. I thought that was an interesting little bit of trivia. But anyway, I want to cut into this. It is this loaf I baked this morning before we ever started so that I had a completely cooled loaf to cut into and show you what it looks like. Because if I cut into this loaf now, it's going to be gummy because it's not finished baking. So I don't want to cut into that one, but this one is completely cool. Get a nice serrated knife. And I'm going to tell you, after the first day, if this doesn't get devoured, it makes wonderful toast slathered with butter the following day or 2. But this is the inside of our loaf. I hope you can see that. All those nice holes, tender crumb, crispy crust. I hope you give this recipe a try. And if you're enjoying my videos, please subscribe to my channel. Give me a thumbs up. Leave a comment. Let me know how a recipe went for you if you tried it. And I will see you next time. Bye.